The political environment was already volatile, but everything escalated fast the moment James Comey's closed-door testimony leaked. It wasn't a summary or a second-hand briefing. It was the full transcript, details, context, and private exchanges that were never supposed to be public. Within minutes, the leak spread across Capitol Hill, and the reaction was immediate. Lawmakers from both parties were caught off guard, staffers scrambled for information, and committees began pointing fingers to find out who released it. But one person reacted faster and more urgently than most: Zohran Mamdani. Because unexpectedly, the leaked transcript referenced discussions and interactions that placed his name inside a federal oversight conversation he never anticipated being part of. It didn't accuse him of wrongdoing. It didn't tie him to any investigation. But the context was damaging enough to trigger a rapid response. In Washington, perception matters more than detail. And the perception created by Comey's testimony, even if indirect, put Mamdani in a difficult position. The transcript included descriptions of internal debates that involved several lawmakers, including Mamdani, in conversations about federal enforcement, communication boundaries, and political pressure. Nothing criminal. Nothing explosive. But in the current political climate, anything that looks like back-channel involvement is treated as a red flag. Mamdani knew immediately that silence wasn't an option. So while Comey himself became the main target of media outrage, Mamdani's team was already on emergency footing. Staffers received alerts to halt all non-essential communications. Internal meetings were called within minutes. Advisors began reviewing the transcript line by line to assess which parts could be used against him. They didn't like what they saw. Not because the content was incriminating, but because it was vague enough for opponents to twist, vague enough for commentators to speculate, and vague enough to draw attention Mamdani didn't want. And Republicans saw the opportunity quickly. Multiple House Republicans released coordinated statements accusing Comey of selectively revealing information during his closed-door testimony, and they highlighted every reference that pointed toward political influence from progressive lawmakers. Even though Mamdani wasn't central to the discussion, the fact that his name appeared gave Republicans a hook. From their perspective, this was an opening to challenge his credibility. They framed it as an example of lawmakers trying to influence federal processes behind the scenes. They suggested it was part of a broader trend of blurred boundaries between politics and federal oversight. None of it was proven, but that didn't matter. In Washington, a leaked transcript doesn't need accuracy. It needs narrative value, and Republicans used it immediately. Cable news networks picked up the angle. Political commentators added speculation. Social media amplified the story faster than Mamdani's team could respond. That's when Elon Musk stepped into the picture, not with an endorsement, not with an attack, but with engagement. His reaction alone turned the story into a national conversation. When Musk highlights political content, his audience expands it instantly. Whether his followers agree or disagree doesn't matter. They generate attention, discussion, and pressure. This transformed the leak from a Capitol Hill issue into a wider public controversy, and that heightened the stakes for Mamdani. He couldn't rely on partisan dismissals or small clarifications. This required a coordinated response. His communications team drafted a statement emphasizing that the transcript contained general references to policy discussions and that he had no involvement in Comey's private briefings. They framed his mention as routine, not unusual. They avoided attacking Comey directly to prevent escalating the story further. But the first statement wasn't enough. Commentators continued speculating. Republicans continued pushing the narrative. And progressive allies were asking internally whether Mamdani needed to take a stronger public stance. So his team began planning a larger strategy, one that combined public reassurance with controlled messaging and targeted outreach. The goal wasn't to fight Comey or defend him. The goal was to separate Mamdani from the fallout and prevent the leak from reshaping his political image. At the same time, Comey was facing pressure from all sides. Republicans accused him of withholding key information. Democrats were frustrated that the leak gave political opponents another line of attack. Committees began preparing for inquiries into how the leak happened in the first place. The situation surrounding Comey was chaotic, but the situation surrounding Mamdani was calculated because exposure, even indirect exposure, forces immediate and strategic decision-making. The most urgent question inside Mamdani's team was simple. How do you control a story you didn't create? The leaked testimony created several problems. It associated Mamdani with federal oversight discussions he hadn't prepared to address. It allowed Republicans to frame him as part of an inappropriate political influence network. It created media speculation without giving him context to respond. It placed him inside a controversy linked to Comey, a figure already heavily polarized. These problems demanded more than a press release. They required coordinated action. Mamdani's advisors recommended 3 immediate steps. Clarification. Issue an expanded statement providing context for his involvement and emphasizing transparency. Outreach. Speak directly to committee leaders, progressive allies, and local officials to stabilize support. Assessment. Determine whether additional parts of the testimony could leak, creating new complications. Because leaks rarely happen once. They usually happen in stages. And Mamdani's team understood the risk. If further testimony sections referenced him, even in passing, the narrative could escalate quickly. So the challenge wasn't only to respond to the current leak. It was to prepare for potential future ones. Meanwhile, Republican strategists increased their pressure campaign. They circulated talking points tying Mamdani to Comey's secretive testimony. They hinted at additional documents. They framed the situation as part of a pattern. It was politics, aggressive, strategic politics. And Mamdani was forced to play defense, even though he wasn't the one who leaked anything. As the noise grew, one fact became unavoidable. This wasn't a single-day controversy. This was the start of a larger narrative battle, and Mamdani had to get ahead of it. Part 2 will go deeper into how his team prepares to navigate the fallout, how Republicans plan to escalate the narrative, and how Comey's leak has created a political fight with no clear end. Once the Comey transcript leak became public, Mamdani's team shifted from initial damage control to full-scale strategic planning. They understood that leaks like this rarely disappear on their own. They grow, they evolve, and the longer a lawmaker waits to respond, the harder it becomes to regain control. So the question wasn't whether to act. It was how aggressively to act, and how quickly. Inside Mamdani's office, the atmosphere was tense. Staffers weren't panicking, but everyone recognized the seriousness of the moment. The mention of Mamdani in the testimony wasn't a direct accusation. It wasn't tied to any investigation, but it put him in proximity to discussions that political opponents could easily weaponize. And in Washington, proximity is often enough. The first step was a detailed internal review. Mamdani's legal advisors and policy staff broke down every line of the transcript that referenced him. They weren't looking for legal threats. There weren't any. They were analyzing how those lines could be interpreted by political opponents, media outlets, or online commentators. Their conclusions were blunt. The references were ambiguous enough for Republicans to spin the story in multiple directions. That meant the response had to be comprehensive. The team debated how publicly Mamdani should address the situation. Some advisors argued for a full press conference, a direct, confident message that would show transparency. Others warned that holding a press conference would amplify a story that wasn't actually about him. The compromise was a phased communication effort. Phase 1, a controlled statement addressing the basic facts. Phase 2, private outreach to key allies to stabilize political support. Phase 3, strategic engagement to reframe the narrative if Republicans escalated. But even as his internal team planned their approach, Republicans were moving faster. As soon as the transcript leaked, GOP committee members began drafting follow-up inquiries. Not because they suspected wrongdoing, but because they saw an opportunity to force Mamdani into the spotlight in a negative way. Their goal wasn't a legal battle, it was political leverage. Republicans began circulating private memos across conservative media networks, framing Mamdani's involvement as questionable. Again, nothing in the testimony justified that word, but in political communications, the suggestion alone is often enough to shape perception. And perception is the battlefield Mamdani now found himself fighting on. Cable news segments started analyzing the transcript, with pundits on both sides trying to interpret the context. Some conservative commentators claim Mamdani was part of quiet coordination efforts, even though the transcript didn't support that claim. Others argued his inclusion showed how deeply progressive lawmakers had inserted themselves into federal processes. None of this was evidence-based, but it was effective at generating public discussion. Meanwhile, progressive allies began expressing frustration. Their concern wasn't the leak itself, it was how the media was framing it. They believed Republicans were trying to undermine progressive influence by attaching Mamdani's name to a broader controversy involving Comey. Some wanted Mamdani to go on offense immediately. Others urged caution, reminding him that attacking Comey or the DOJ could backfire. This created an internal divide. Should Mamdani defend himself aggressively or remain measured? Mamdani chose a middle approach. He would defend himself, but he wouldn't escalate unnecessarily. He held a series of private conversations with fellow Democrats to reassure them that he had nothing to hide. The goal wasn't to win them over. It was to prevent them from distancing themselves out of fear. Because distancing is one of the most damaging things that can happen to a politician during a controversy. It signals weakness, it invites speculation, and it encourages opponents to push harder. So Mamdani made sure his colleagues understood the situation directly from him, not from media interpretation. At the same time, his team began monitoring online reactions, especially after Elon Musk's engagement with the topic. Musk's influence meant the story would continue spreading far beyond Washington, reaching people who generally don't track congressional proceedings or oversight testimonies. This kind of visibility can quickly create misinformation, so Mamdani's advisors recommended a proactive approach. Targeted clarifications on platforms where Musk's comments circulated. Not a confrontation, not a debate, just clear information in the spaces where the conversation was happening. And while Mamdani was working to protect his name, Comey was dealing with an entirely different crisis. Republicans accused him of selectively presenting information in closed-door testimony. Democrats were frustrated that private discussions had been exposed, creating vulnerability for multiple members. Committee leaders were demanding to know how the leak happened and whether more transcripts were at risk. Comey was being pulled in different directions, and his struggle only complicated the environment for everyone else mentioned in the transcript, including Mamdani. Because when the central figure in a leak is under pressure, the fallout becomes unpredictable. It spreads. It affects people who weren't supposed to be part of the narrative. For Mamdani, the unpredictability was the main threat, not the content, not the legal implications. The narrative. Republicans weren't interested in the details. They were interested in the opportunity. They wanted to connect Mamdani's name to anything that looked questionable. And because the transcript lacked context, they had room to speculate. That's why his team's second phase outreach was critical. They contacted journalists they trusted, not to manipulate coverage, but to ensure context was available to counter speculation. They provided clear explanations of the references to Mamdani. They flagged any interpretations that were misleading or taken out of context. Meanwhile, progressive organizations that supported Mamdani began preparing their own responses. Some created informational breakdowns of the transcript. Others pushed back against Republican claims directly on social media. A few even began organizing to prevent the story from being used as a political weapon against progressive candidates more broadly. But even with that support, Mamdani's team understood they were dealing with a long-term issue. The leak wouldn't vanish overnight. Republicans would continue pushing. The media would continue analyzing. More details from the testimony could surface. So the main objective became controlling the pace of the controversy. If they could prevent Republicans from escalating the narrative too fast, they could buy enough time to reshape the public understanding of the leak. And that's where Mamdani's next move becomes important. He planned a structured, carefully timed response. Not just a statement, but a series of appearances designed to put the focus back on his policy work and away from Comey's leak. This wasn't about ignoring the controversy. It was about crowding it out with new, more relevant information. But before he could begin that offensive strategy, he needed to stabilize his position within the party. That would determine how bold he could be in the next phase. Part 3 will break down that next phase. The internal pressures, the GOP escalation plan, how Democrats navigate the fallout, and what Mamdani has to do to stay ahead of a controversy he never wanted to be tied to. By the time the Comey leak reached its second news cycle, the situation was no longer about interpretation. It was about survival. Mamdani understood that. Republicans understood that. And Democratic leadership, watching from the sidelines, understood it best of all. The next phase wasn't about clarifying what happened. It was about positioning. The leak had created a narrative vacuum. And in Washington, a vacuum doesn't stay empty. Someone fills it, either intentionally or by force. For Republicans, the strategy was obvious. Keep Mamdani tied to the fallout long enough to weaken his influence. They didn't need evidence of wrongdoing. They didn't need a direct connection. They only needed the impression that he was involved in something he shouldn't have been. So they escalated quickly. Committee chairs began drafting letters demanding clarification about all communications referenced in the Comey transcript. Mamdani wasn't the primary target, but his name was included in the addressees, which was enough to create headlines implying he was under formal inquiry. This was political pressure disguised as oversight. Republican strategists then pushed the message across their media networks. If Mamdani had nothing to do with Comey's testimony, why was he mentioned? If he wasn't involved in anything improper, why were committees including him in follow-up requests? It didn't matter that the answer was simple. He had been mentioned in passing, not implicated. Complex truth rarely beats a simple question, and Mamdani's team knew they had to counter this immediately. They ramped up their internal coordination, staffers producing rapid response fact sheets, communications aides tracking every misleading claim in real time, legal advisors drafting potential statements if Republicans escalated further. But the hardest part wasn't responding to Republicans. It was navigating the split inside Mamdani's own party. Progressives wanted a fight. Moderates wanted distance. Leadership wanted silence. That put Mamdani in the middle of a three-way pressure system. Progressives argued the Comey leak exposed a pattern of federal secrecy and political maneuvering that needed to be challenged. They pushed for Mamdani to speak forcefully, not just to defend himself, but to use the moment to highlight structural issues in the oversight process. Moderates, on the other hand, were growing uncomfortable with the attention. They didn't want Mamdani's name dominating news cycles. They didn't want Republicans gaining ammunition. And they quietly encouraged him to stay measured, code for "don't escalate and take us down with you." Leadership maintained a careful distance. No one condemned him. No one defended him. They simply hoped the story would fade on its own. But Mamdani didn't have the luxury of waiting for a fade out. Every hour that passed gave Republicans more time to shape the story. So he initiated the next phase of his strategy, internal stabilization. He scheduled private calls with key Democratic figures, explaining his limited connection to the transcript and emphasizing that the references were general, not investigative. He needed these allies to feel confident enough not to publicly waver, because public wavering is the political equivalent of blood in the water. At the same time, Mamdani's staff coordinated with progressive organizations to align messaging. Their goal wasn't to create a unified narrative. That wasn't realistic. The goal was to prevent chaotic messaging that could be twisted against them. Meanwhile, Republicans continued their escalation. Some members hinted that more leaks could still surface, a strategy designed to create uncertainty, even if no such leaks existed. Others pushed publicly for Comey to testify again, this time in an open session. A few demanded an entirely new series of inquiries into political influence on federal oversight. All of this pressure served one purpose: keep Mamdani's name in the conversation. The longer he was associated with the fallout, the more difficult it would be for him to steer the story back toward policy work. And then Elon Musk's continued engagement added another unpredictable element. Each time Musk posted about the transcript, reacted to commentary, or questioned federal transparency, it reignited the online discussion. His influence meant the story never stayed contained to Washington. It kept expanding outward, to independent voters, to political skeptics, to the massive online audience that watches political controversies like unfolding live events. This prevented Mamdani's team from controlling the pacing of the fallout. Every time they made progress in calming the narrative, a new wave of attention would ripple out from Musk's audience. It wasn't deliberate sabotage, but it was a complication Mamdani had no control over. Recognizing the long-term nature of the situation, his team shifted from short-term crisis management to extended narrative strategy. The new objective was simple: define Mamdani before others define him. They began drafting a series of appearances where he could talk about policy priorities unrelated to the leak. They planned issue-focused interviews that would allow him to reassert his role in national debates. They prepared community engagement events designed to rebuild momentum around his legislative agenda. This wasn't about ignoring the controversy. It was about preventing the controversy from consuming his identity. But even with all these moves, there was still one major obstacle: the possibility of follow-up leaks. Comey's transcript represented one part of a closed-door session. If additional sections surfaced, even innocuous ones, Republicans would gain new openings to prolong the narrative. So Mamdani's advisors began preparing for that scenario as well. They mapped out potential messaging for different variations of future leaks. They studied past political fallout cases to anticipate how Republicans might weaponize new transcripts. They examined every public statement Mamdani had made over the previous months to check for vulnerabilities. This level of preparation wasn't excessive. It was necessary, because the leak had transformed into something larger than expected, not a scandal, but an ongoing political liability. A liability Republicans would exploit, Democrats would try to avoid, and the public would follow closely as long as figures like Musk kept the spotlight on it. By the end of the second day, Mamdani's team reached a clear conclusion. They weren't dealing with a one-time controversy. They were dealing with a long-term narrative battle. Part 4 will break down how Mamdani's team pivots from defense to offense, how Republicans plan to extend the damage, and how this leak has quietly shifted the broader power dynamics inside the Democratic coalition. By the time the Comey leak reached its final stretch in the news cycle, it was clear that the situation was no longer about the transcript itself. It was about the long-term political impact: who got hurt, who gained an advantage, and who walked away looking stronger than they did going in. And for Zohran Mamdani, the final stage was about closing the narrative on his own terms. The most important realization inside his team was simple: if the story wasn't going away on its own, they had to end it intentionally. Not by ignoring it, not by escalating it, but by stabilizing the conversation and shutting down the room for speculation. To do that, Mamdani needed to shift out of crisis mode and into consolidation, taking everything learned from the first days of chaos and turning it into a controlled final message. The first step was confirming that no additional leaks were coming. Even though Mamdani had no involvement in Comey's testimony, the uncertainty around future transcript releases created unnecessary anxiety inside his office. His legal advisors made a point of monitoring committee channels and communicating with staffers close to the oversight process. Once they felt confident the leak was an isolated incident, the tone inside the office changed. The panic was gone. The defensive posture was gone. Now it was about securing the outcome. Meanwhile, Republicans continued trying to extend the story. Their approach wasn't aggressive anymore. It was repetitive. Short statements, cable hits, social media posts hinting that more questions remain. They knew they didn't have more material. They simply wanted to keep the association alive for as long as possible. But repetition without new information has a predictable lifespan. By the fourth day, political reporters started asking the same question. What exactly are Republicans alleging here? That shift mattered. It meant the burden of proof was no longer on Mamdani. It was on his opponents. And they didn't actually have proof of anything. This is when Mamdani made his most important move. He stopped talking about the leak completely. He didn't attack Republicans. He didn't revisit Comey. He didn't justify or correct anything that didn't require correction. Instead, he redirected all public communication to policy, housing, transit, financial regulation, community reinvestment. Every interview request was filtered. Every statement was focused on ongoing legislative work. Every public appearance emphasized topics that had nothing to do with private testimony or federal oversight. This wasn't avoidance. It was message discipline. And it worked, because the media only pushes a story as long as the story pushes back. Once Mamdani stopped giving the leak oxygen, the coverage started slowing down. At the same time, progressive organizations stepped in to reinforce his position. They published breakdowns of the transcript, highlighting how minimal his mention truly was. They countered misleading claims directly. They pressured reporters to cover the broader context instead of the speculation. Their involvement helped close the loop. Moderates finally relaxed as well. Without new developments, and without Mamdani escalating the issue, there was no incentive to worry about internal fallout. Leadership quietly signaled that the party wasn't interested in dragging the story out any further. And just like that, the controversy began tapering off. But the final element in the process was one Mamdani didn't control: public perception. Elon Musk's earlier engagement gave the story a huge national audience. But by the time the final phase arrived, even Musk's occasional commentary wasn't enough to revive it. Without new revelations, without new documents, without new accusations, the conversation naturally shifted. This left the political landscape in a very different place from where it started. Comey took the brunt of the backlash. Republicans gained a short-term messaging win, but no long-term leverage. Moderates avoided a fight. Progressives grew more cohesive because the incident reinforced their distrust of federal secrecy. And Mamdani? He walked out with the least damage of anyone mentioned. That's not because the leak was harmless. It wasn't. It's because his response was measured, coordinated, and focused on controlling the exit, not the drama. He didn't panic on camera. He didn't lash out at Comey. He didn't take the bait from Republicans. He didn't fight the media. He didn't turn a minor mention into a major confrontation. He treated the controversy like a temporary narrative problem, not a permanent identity problem. That's why he survived it. And in Washington, survival is the difference between losing influence and gaining it. By closing the controversy cleanly, Mamdani proved something that even his critics quietly acknowledged. He can take political pressure, redirect the conversation, and regain control without self-inflicted damage. In a town where many lawmakers crumble under scrutiny, that matters. And when the next battle comes, because there's always a next battle, this experience will shape how he prepares and how others approach him. Not every leak becomes a scandal. Not every mention becomes a threat. And not every lawmaker emerges from a manufactured controversy stronger than they entered. But this time, Mamdani did. Thank you for watching this video. Click here to watch another video that might interest you.